This is the new TC Pride Podcast, episode 128, on location in Minneapolis with Avenues for Homeless Youth. Twin Cities Pride Podcast, we are on location in Minneapolis at Avenues for Homeless Youth, and I'm here with
Ryan Berg.
And Ryan, what is your role in the organization?
I am the program manager for the Connect Host Home program.
So Avenues has been on the podcast before from time to time. A few years ago, they were actually Twin Cities Pride's nonprofit of the year. What can you tell people about Avenues and the services they provide to the community?
Sure. So we work with young people experiencing homelessness, ages 16 to 24. We have two shelter-based programs, one in North Minneapolis and one in Brooklyn Park. We have two host home programs, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. And we have a young families program for young folks experiencing homelessness who are parents.
And I was introduced recently to this host home program. It sounds like a really great program. Well, one thing we should do is we should set the stage by letting people know that aren't aware already is that homelessness tends to disproportionately affect LGBTQ youth, which is one of the reasons that this program is so important.
Right. So the latest research that just came out last year from Chapin Hall in Chicago shows that LGBT youth are 120 times more likely to experience homelessness than their straight and cisgender peers. So Host Home is really a community-based response to youth homelessness. We center the most marginalized young people, so that's LGBT youth and youth of color. And Host Home is a community-based response. So folks in the community open up their home, provide food and shelter, and Avenues provides wraparound services and support.
And this program has been going on for a little while.
Yeah, so the GLBT Host Home program started 22 years ago, and it was really the community saying we needed to do something. Shelters were not affirming spaces for LGBT youth. A lot of LGBT youth were reporting discrimination and violence based off of their identity or sexual orientation. So the community said, what can we do to step up and provide an affirming space?
And like I said, we really kind of wanted to get in depth with this program today. You did say that there are a few other programs that Avenues offers. What did you want to say about maybe a few of those before we get too deep into the host program?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, we have two site-based programs, so that's going to be shelter and transitional living programs. So these are places where young people can stay up to their 21st birthday or for 18 months, whatever comes first, and they receive wraparound services and support and help them move into the next phase of their life. And the Young Families program is unique as well. Nearly 40% of young people experiencing homelessness are parents themselves. So this is an apartment program where we help young families find apartments and provide vouchers and help them with independent living skills and parenting support.
And so like any nonprofit, I imagine that your funding tends to come from several different sources. Where does the majority of the funding for these programs come from?
Well, for Host Home in particular, it's going to be foundations and personal donors. United Way is a big funder for us as well, and the Arise Project helps us out quite a bit. And then also with the shelters, there's they're licensed, so there's going to be county, state, and federal funds involved as well.
And so let's dig into this host program a little bit more. So to help us do that, so we actually have another special guest, so we're going to bring into the conversation in a second. And we have one of the youth that's actually been involved in the program today.
Correct, yeah. So Mason has decided to join us for this conversation. And Mason was a participant in the Host Home program as a young person in the Connect program, the one I run. So that was a short-term emergency-based program. So we worked with Mason for, in two host homes for about 5 months in the first one and a couple months in the second one.
Mason, how are you doing? Thanks for being here today.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
So we had a couple of specific questions we wanted to ask about the program, and Ryan, feel free to follow up with any additional information you have about any of these questions. So Mason, the first thing we wanted to ask you about was what was the biggest surprise about your experience with the Host Home program?
The biggest surprise for me was how welcoming the environment actually ended up being right away. When you come into somebody's home, especially after a situation like homelessness and actively being homeless, you don't really get a lot of welcome into any sort of open space. And it was really nice and super surprising to be welcomed into somebody's home so quickly without them knowing you at all.
And Ryan, based on your experience, is this a pretty common common sentiment among the youth who are involved in the program, as well as the host home providers?
Yeah, it's part of our training, right? So we want to ensure that all young people, no matter how they identify, are feeling affirmed in the spaces that they enter into, and recognizing that they haven't historically had that experience. So that could be negative experiences in shelter, or on the streets, or finding resources. So creating an affirming space and a non-judgmental kind of point of view is really important.
And so after that initial impression, Mason, how long did it take you to sort of start to feel comfortable and kind of can you explain the housing environment in general?
Yeah, so the house itself was really nice and welcoming. My first two hosts, Marissa and Lindsay, they had two dogs, so I really loved being there right away. But the actual comfort didn't actually start until about a month into living there. It takes you a minute to actually realize that these people do want to help you and that they're here to really support you. And having my own space was weird, so just getting used to everything took a little bit, but after about a month, things were comfortable.
And after a little while, I suppose you start socializing, doing the grocery shopping, going to movies, those kinds of things.
Yeah, exactly. So it depends host by host and what the youth needs and wants out of the host home program. For me, I didn't want to create a family unit specifically. I just wanted somewhere where I could go at the end of the day because I worked full time and I just needed people to give me the chance that I thought I deserved. And they were able to provide that. And a way to help make me feel comfortable is they would offer to do things with me. They let me go to IKEA, which isn't always something that people just want to do, but they were totally open for it. And we went and got dinner a couple times and we watched a movie that I wanted to watch on Netflix. And they did a great job of finding ways to bond without forcing it on you.
And I would assume, Ryan, that every youth would sort of have a different ideal sort of structure that would make them comfortable in any kind of housing environment.
Right. So all of our programming with Host Home is really about being youth determined and youth driven. So we really work with hosts on letting youth lead the way and recognizing that not all young people are going to want a parental figure in their life. Not all young people are going to want to be checked in on all the time. So really listening to what the youth are saying they need and want and responding accordingly.
And Mason, what can you tell us about the home visits?
So we had home visits where they weekly they were weekly. They were a little uncomfortable because, you come into this new space and you're already a little uncomfortable to begin with. And then you're being introduced to these meetings where it sounds like, what are you doing wrong in this house? And that's not what they want you to feel like at all. But that's initially when you're in a fight or flight mode, your first thought is that these people are here to tell me all the things that I'm doing wrong and to kick me out. But that's not what it is. It's just to see the differences and connect with you and your hosts and make sure that it's a good fit and make sure that if there are any differences that you're experiencing, how you can work past those. Initially, they were always uncomfortable, but after a while, you start to open up, especially if there isn't a bunch of huge issues, then it just becomes a nice little check-in to tell them how well you're doing versus how not well you're doing.
And Ryan, what can you tell us about these home visits as it relate to either the short-term program or the longer-term program?
Sure. So the program that Mason was in was called Connect, which is the short-term emergency-based host home program. So we would meet weekly. With the GLBT host home program, that's the long-term program where the average stay is about a year. They would meet about once a month. So the whole idea, Mason nailed it, is not to focus in on what's going wrong, but to really kind of be strengths-based and say, these are the things that are working right. What can we do as a program and as a community to support you and support this new relationship? Because it's scary on all sides, and we want to make sure that everyone feels affirmed.
And what about like dietary preferences? I mean, is there any judgment? I mean, I'm vegetarian, so like I can imagine, people have their different dietary preferences. What was that like?
So for me, I tried to stay as simple as possible. I just requested bagels and soup, and that was about it. I didn't want to be too high maintenance. I was able to go grocery shopping with them once. Their initial plan that they had, because they did it with past people, is that you go to the grocery store, they give you a budget, and you can wander off and get whatever you want. And as long as it stays within budget, they'll get it for you. But because I worked full time, our schedules just didn't line up, so I wasn't able to do that more than once or twice. But they were very good at just asking me if there was anything I wanted, and if it wasn't that much, which usually it wasn't, then they were totally fine with getting it. Or even if you did want a little more, if you can get more than just bagels and soup, that's not required. But I myself was just a little uncomfortable with asking for more. I didn't want to be too much for anyone, especially since I was being welcomed into someone's home. I didn't want to do anything that could risk being taken out or have them think that I'm taking advantage of them or anything like that.
Right. So the ask of the program is food and shelter, right? So the hosts go in knowing that they're going to be providing food and shelter. But what Mason really touched on is something that we see often, which is young people feeling like they don't want to take advantage. And so oftentimes it takes a while to build up enough trust to actually ask for food or to put food on that grocery list. So we just ask hosts to be patient, caring, and consistent, and just kind of return to that question to ensure that young people know that their needs will be met and their food preferences will be met as well.
And Mason, so I understand that. So sometimes the longer term program isn't available right away, and that was kind of your experience.
Yeah. So I was only supposed to stay with my first host for a couple of months. The goal is to get out and find my own permanent living situation, and that's just not what happened. So I was only there for about 5 or 6 months, and I ended up having to go into a second host home.
And Ryan, how does that normally work?
Yeah, so there are long-term supportive housing programs out there that young people can apply for. And in Mason's case, his name just didn't come up. So we had to react to that and respond to that. And so Mason's initial hosts were able to host for a certain amount of time. So we had to find another host for Mason in the interim as he continued to look for longer-term housing solutions. And so we found a second host for Mason a few months after his move-in with the initial host.
And then the actual transition moving from one host to another was really hard. I didn't want to move. I knew that I had to. My original hosts I knew that they were just trying to do what they thought was best for me. I had the basement floor and it was getting really cold and they didn't have any carpeting down there and they didn't want me to be down there frozen. So they wanted me to go somewhere that would be better for me. But even knowing that their intentions were good, having to move again after being told that everything was supposed to be stable now was really razzling, and it threw me way off my guard. But you can't just freak out, so you have to just go along with things and hope that they get better. And it was hard to go from one style of living to a different style of living and have to get reconnected with a person and have to make a new connection and re-explain myself if needed. I'm not gonna, if someone has a question for me, I'm usually down to answer, but you're answering the same 7 questions over and over again. And I just didn't want to do that again. I was already really used to my host and I really liked them, and I didn't want to have to try and reform a bond with a new person. And it was a hard transition. It was worth it because I was able to find my own spot eventually, but the actual having to move into another person's home was not ideal.
Which, Ryan, I guess, must happen from time to time, where there are just circumstances that sort of complicate any sort of host home situation, and there are ways that avenue is equipped to sort of deal with those.
Sure. So yeah, there's just, the reality is there's a lack of resources and housing support, right? So we have to act accordingly to when things don't work out as we would hoped or had planned. And what Mason said is really true. It takes a certain level of vulnerability to open yourself up to a stranger in the first place, and so to have to do that all over again is incredibly challenging. So as a program, we totally recognize that, and we want to be supportive in that. So, we are in constant communication with the young person and talking with the host and doing those home visits in ways to affirm and hopefully make that transition a little less difficult. We also talk with young people about mental health support. So if there's need for a therapist, or if they need a counselor, they need someone to talk to as this transition is happening, we are able to provide those recommendations.
And I'm guessing there's support for the hosts as well, right? Because I'm assuming like most of the time or often, like this is the first time the host is doing this too, so they also like have questions and probably need support along the way.
For sure. So we do something called a host home community network, and that's the first Saturday of every month where hosts can come together and talk, problem solve, discuss challenges, talk about successes. And then every third host home community network is a refresher training. So all hosts go through 16 hours of training before they're able to host. So the refresher trainings are deeper dives into maybe it's trauma-informed care. That's a complicated topic. Can we do a deeper dive into that? Or maybe harm reduction is a challenging issue. Can we talk more about that? So we do have ongoing trainings and support groups for both hosts and young people.
And Mason, what about guests or friends? Did you have like a specific arrangement with your host about that?
Yeah, so for having my own personal guests, it was pretty simple. I didn't have very many people come over. For my first host, it was as long as there's not anyone in the house while we're gone for a prolonged period of time, you're allowed to have your guests over. Mostly just text us to let us know if you're going to have an extra person in the house. And there wasn't the need to have a long introduction with my friends. If I wanted to introduce, I could, but it wasn't required for them to know exactly who was coming in and out, which made things a little more comfortable for me, so I could keep the privacy and not have to share my whole life with someone. The only problem that I had with guests was in my second host home. My host didn't tell me that she would have a lot of guests coming in and out. And, I guess it goes both ways where you need to be able to communicate that. But it was difficult to be in someone's house where there was constantly people coming in and out when it was supposed to be a safe space for me, even though I understood that it wasn't my home and you're allowed to bring guests into your home. But part of the point of the program is to help your youth feel safe and welcome, and having unexpected guests for prolonged periods of time that come in and out was really unnerving for me.
And Ryan, so are there like I imagine there's probably general guidelines around guests with the host program?
So host home, we don't have a lot of black and white rules. A lot of it lives in the gray, and we're not going to prescribe rules for hosts in their own homes. But what we do is we come together and talk about what works best for young people and for hosts and try to find some kind of commonality and solution. We say that all relationships are magical and messy, and some of that messy stuff living in community definitely comes up in host homes. So, what are the ways in which we can be really clear around what our boundaries are while being flexible at the same time.
And Mason, so I imagine there are times where like the hosts are maybe gone for like an extended period of time, like during travel or something like that. How do you handle those situations?
Yeah, so my first host actually really liked to travel. They liked to camp, or they had family outside of the state that they would want to be able to see over the holidays. And for me, that worked out really well. I didn't mind them being gone for prolonged periods of time because I could kind of roam about the house as comfortable as I wanted without worrying about bothering other people. They offered that if that was too much to be in their house by myself, that I could be placed into another home temporarily or switch altogether since they do travel a lot. They had pets, and they didn't expect me to look after them, even though I did. I loved the pets, but it wasn't my set responsibility to look after the house so intensely while they're gone. So yeah, that ended up working pretty well for me. I know other people have had things where they might need to move, but for myself, I didn't mind being by myself.
And Ryan, I would presume that would be like a pretty common disqualifier, like for people like would disqualify themselves. Well, I travel all the time, so I can't participate in this program. What would you say to people that maybe would be thinking in those terms?
If people are really interested in the program and believe in the program, the Connect short-term host home program would be a good fit for them if they travel a lot. So we match young people anywhere from a day to 3 months with that program. And if a host tells us, we do travel a lot, maybe they can only do respite, which would be like a week or 2 weeks. So we can adjust to make that work. And
so Mason, it sounds like every situation is different within the host home program. Sometimes youth will communicate more with their hosts and sometimes less. What was sort of the process for communicating with your hosts sort of on a regular basis? Was there like texting involved? Did you like talk a lot in person? How did that work for you?
Yeah, for me personally, it was mostly text notifications. They didn't need to know exactly where I was all the time. It was mostly just, are you going to be home tonight? If not, let us know. If you're bringing a guest over, let us know. If we're going to be gone, we'll let you know. And it was pretty simple for me, the communication part with Marissa and Lindsay. For my second host, I did need to ask her to start having her phone by her bed at night, just in case I wanted to get in contact her at night for whatever reason. She used to charge her phone downstairs outside of her bedroom, and I needed her to change that so I could be in communication with her if need be, and she was totally willing to switch that little bit up about herself. Other than that, the communication is pretty easy. I've heard of hosts doing Google Calendar things with each other, so you can so you can schedule things amongst each other. But for me, it was mostly just texting, or if we happen to be in the house all together, then we'll do a little check-in.
And I'm guessing, Ryan, the level of communication, the comfort level there would vary widely from host to host.
Yeah, it's really case by case. And there's, like I said, we don't prescribe kind of remedies around that. It's what makes sense to the young person or what makes sense to the host. So we've had young people who really only want to communicate through text with their hosts, and we've had young people who are, engaged in, have family dinner every night with the young person, the host and the young person. So yeah, it varies case by case.
So another thing that must come up a lot is like the topic of like access and entry and codes and keys and that kind of thing. How did that work out for you, Mason?
For me, I was real lucky. For my first home, they have a little keypad number lock thing, so they just gave me my own code that I could use. So that worked out really well. And then my second host did a lockbox on the doorknob with a spare key in it. I didn't have to worry about carrying a key on my person, which was very nice because the anxiety of having to hold someone else's key to their house, and what if you lose it? That sounds like a great way to break someone's trust and a great way to get thrown out, even though that's not necessarily what would happen. That's immediately where your brain goes, is that you're going to get thrown out, especially if you lose the key to their home. So I was lucky where they just were able to do a hands-free thing for me.
That's something I think maybe a lot of people wouldn't even consider, but is that like a common sentiment with youth sometimes, like that anxiety about like that trust issue?
That anxiety and trust issue is huge, and we hear that throughout young people in host home, that for the tiniest transgression, they assume that they'll be asked to leave. And again, it's that trust thing, and it's also the power dynamic, right, between those who have resources and that are sharing resources with young people. So it makes sense that a young person would feel like the tiniest transgression would send them on their way, but it's not the case. We work really hard with hosts on understanding positive youth development and trauma and resiliency and ways to respond in a strengths-based approach to challenges that young people may be experiencing.
And so, Mason, you said that you weren't expected to take care of the entire house while the hosts maybe were on vacation or while they were gone. But around like chores and your expectations for kind of cleaning up after yourself, kind of what are the general, what was your sort of general experience around that?
Yeah, for my first host, it was real simple. I had my own space with a door, so I didn't ever worry about my room. But for the general communal space, it was just a clean up after yourself. If I left dishes in the sink, they'd just say, "Hey, could you do these real quick?" And then I would get them done immediately. And they didn't really ask me to take out the garbage or the recycling or compost. It was just my job to make sure that I organized my trash accordingly. I didn't have to actually take it out, and I didn't have to walk the dogs or anything like that. Going into my second host home, I did need to help out a lot more, which was a bit of a transition to go from only taking care of myself to now taking care of the both of us. I had to take out the trash and help clean up dishes after a meal, and which was fine. It wasn't hard to do those things. It was just a little bit of a living transition to go from only taking care of myself to now taking care of the both of us.
And so, Ryan, so anyone who's ever lived with anyone, right? So take the host program out of it for a second, roommates or what have you, right? Those kinds of little things can quickly add up, right? And can become like a source of conflict. I'm guessing that Avenues has realized this and has figured out ways to be proactive about this.
For sure. So, yes. So there resentments can grow pretty easily and quickly when things aren't clearly communicated. So part of my job and my coworker Ashley's job as program managers is to not only be an advocate and main support for hosts, but to also challenge hosts and process with hosts around when these challenges come up. And then the case managers work with young people on the very same thing. So we're constantly in communication around those things to ensure the best we can that resentments don't grow and that we're clearly communicating, like the whys of if someone's being asked something to do something in the home. I mean, yeah, like you mentioned, this is community living, right? And so it can get messy, and so we want to make sure that people are feeling affirmed in that experience.
And Mason, what about being introduced to neighbors and being made to feel comfortable in sort of the wider community that you're a part of when you're part of this host home program?
Yeah, my first host did ask me how I should or how I wanted to be addressed, because they talk to their neighbors and they're very friendly, and they wanted to know what would make me feel most comfortable, if I should say that I'm an exchange student, or if I'm a cousin, or if I'm their kid, or not to mention me at all. And it was just whatever felt most comfortable. Their neighbors knew that they were a part of host home, I believe, so I didn't really mind being said that I was part of their program that way. I didn't spend a lot of time with their neighbors, so if they were just like, oh, who is that kid coming in and out of your house? I'm like, oh, we're hosting, and that was totally fine with me. My second host didn't do that at all with me, so it was weird. Their neighbors didn't really come over or anything, but when there was these people in the house that I didn't know, it felt kind of weird. Like, should I explain who I am to these people, or should I just wave and then run into my room because they have no clue who this random person is? That was a little uncomfortable, but the best thing to do was to just ask what I felt most comfortable with, and that worked out.
Yeah, so we want to honor the confidentiality of a young person who's experiencing homelessness and a part of this program. They don't need to be outed unnecessarily to neighbors or people in the community. So we really stress to hosts to follow the youth's lead on how they would like to be introduced. So if that means I'm just a family friend staying over, or I'm a family member, or I'm just a guest in the home, be as vague as they need to be. So we really stress following the lead and the youth determination on how they'd like to be identified.
And so Mason, as someone who's gone through the host program, as someone who's experienced firsthand, what would be your advice to someone that's thinking about becoming a host?
To think long and hard about why you want to be a part of the host home program and how dedicated you are to actually staying in it. You can be hyped about the idea of helping someone, or you can be excited to share your home with someone, but why? Is it just because you want to give to charity in a way? Is it because you kind of want a kid but never had one? Or is it just because you know that there are youth that are struggling and they just need to be given the chances that they deserve to be able to succeed like any other person? And if you go in with the right reasons, even with the ups and downs, it can be definitely worth it, but you have to do it for the right reasons.
And I'm guessing Avenues poses a lot of these questions to potential hosts.
Right. So there's a lot of that in the training. So the second day of the training is really turning the lens inward and really interrogating our own values, our beliefs, our assumptions, our expectations. We live in a state where there are some of the worst racial disparities in the country, and the vast majority of folks who are able to volunteer and host are white. The vast majority of young people we're working with are youth of color. So there is a power dynamic that's askew inherently in this relationship. We do our best to train and to hold space with hosts on racial and economic equity issues and fight for those to ensure that there's a shift in that relationship. And so, yeah, I think what Mason hit on is incredibly important. So we with Host Home have a philosophy of solidarity rather than charity. So it's really about us and us rather than us and them.
And so when it comes to recruiting hosts, what's sort of your general most effective way of doing that?
Every way. So Ashley, my coworker, and I go out and speak at events all over the Twin Cities, and we paper neighborhoods. It's really about community engagement and really finding ways to tap into community resources. So if that means speaking at a school, speaking at a community network, a church, we will do it. And
we see you guys out there all the time when we're doing the podcast. You guys are tabling in a lot of different events.
We'll be tabling at Pride, right? So we're definitely tabling everywhere we are asked to or we can. So that's definitely one way. And and things like this, like having interviews, doing media events whenever possible as well.
And for people who are interested in potentially being involved in the program, you guys have information sessions from time to time?
Yeah, correct. So we'll have a bunch of information sessions for the next year. Our next one's going to be May 23rd in Richfield, followed by one in Powderhorn on June 12th. And our next training is Saturday and Sunday, July 13th and 14th. If folks are interested, they can contact avenuesforyouth.org.
And so lastly, as we're wrapping up here, I kind of wanted to ask both of you, maybe in your own words, about why you feel this host home program is so important.
For me, I just needed the chance. I needed an opportunity, and I needed someone there who could help give that to me. The finding a place to live on your own and finding your own resources can be really hard when you don't have someone who is experienced helping you out, and the host home program provides that.
So there are about 6,000 young people experiencing homelessness in the state of Minnesota, and we have about 1,000 youth-specific beds for those young folks. So community really needs to step up and take action to make a dent in this issue. Also, LGBT youth report time and time again that they don't feel safe and affirmed in shelters and other programs. So this program is really designed to be affirming on every level for young folks, and I think that's a really impactful and important element of our work.
And so we talked a little bit, Ryan, about sort of where the funding for this program comes from. Like any nonprofit, I imagine there are a lot of different ways that people get involved. What are a few ways that people can aside from like being a host, right? What are some of the ways that people can help out aside from that?
Folks can contact avenuesforyouth.org and they can become a volunteer. They can make a donation. They can advocate for the programs as well. So, for example, even if you can't host, we always ask folks, but if you believe in the program, we ask folks that they talk to their community members about the host home program, maybe set up an info session for us to come and do, in their home and talk about host home with their community. So ways to advocate. I think, we use the 3 Ps. So if it's professional, personal, or policy-wise, if you can engage in community in one of those ways and talk about our programs, that always helps as well.
And Mason, what would you say to any youth that might be out there listening to this right now?
To do it, be a part of the program. Don't let yourself be alone in this process. It's hard, and you need people to be there for you. You don't have to do things by yourself. It's impossible to do things by yourself. Teamwork makes the dream work, and you have to let people help you. And if you see your friends struggling, don't feel bad that you can't let them sleep on your couch. Get into these programs and tell them that you know people that need their help, and they'll be able to help find resources for your friends. You don't have to put the responsibility on yourself when you're also a young person that's struggling.
That sounds like fantastic advice. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of the TC Pride podcast. Thank you, both of you, for being here to help get the word out about this incredible program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great.
And thank you for listening to the TC Pride podcast. We'll see you next time.
The TC Pride podcast is a production of the NonPod, nonprofit podcast community, and Twin Cities Pride. Subscribe now on iTunes, on Android, or by email at tcpridepodcast.org. Because we're in this together. NonPod turns your email newsletter, blog, or video content into a more powerful, more personal, more intimate, on-demand listening experience. Your podcast, your story, your voice, simplified, amplified. Learn more now at nonpod.com.